Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you are joining us. I'm very excited to introduce our special guest today. Lindsay Fauntleroy is an acupuncturist, integrative flower essence therapist, and the author of In Our Element, Using the Five Elements as Soul Medicine. She teaches personal and professional classes through the Spirit Seed, a school rooted in ancestral understandings of health, humanity, nature, and the cosmos. Lindsay, it is a great pleasure to have you joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited for our conversation today.
Me too. It's definitely an area I'm really interested in learning more about. Let's just dive into this exciting topic. So, can you share with us your kind of area of expertise around the African and indigenous healing systems?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think the best way to start that exploration is through a story because it really contextualizes how I got to be so invested and committed to this sacred medicine. And that is, I came to this work through my own journey to fertility. And so I couldn't get pregnant. I was diagnosed with premature ovarian failure, which luckily is not a phrase that's used anymore. But I was so devastated. And everywhere I turned, from my OBGYN to I just really tried everything and it wasn't working. And so I started looking to other forms of healing. And so by synchronicity, by coincidence, by divine intervention, by luck, however we want to frame it, I was introduced to flower essences and I was introduced to the power of spiritual community and collective prayer. And I was introduced to acupuncture and all of the things that are at the heart of my practice now. And what I learned in my own process of healing was that there was so much more to me than just my body. There was so much more to me than just what I could address through my physical health. And so I got really, really, really interested in not just how my body was changing as I was going through my healing process, but how my heart was changing, how my perspective was changing, how I was actually beginning to look at the world and my life through new eyes. And that is what drew me to Indigenous and diasporic psychology, because it is a medicine that is rooted in this idea that we are more than just the physical and that as we connect to the part of ourself that extends beyond the physical, the part of ourself that is more psyche and soul and energy and movement, that there is so much healing that can be done on that level before and including what we do for our physical bodies.
Thank you so much for sharing that background. That's so wonderful. And I love this idea of integrating the wisdom about health from all humanity, from all the different systems, and having them all have a voice. Because I personally believe there's no one specific path, right? Everybody has their healing journey. So thank you so much for sharing your story about that.
Thank you. And I share that. And not only do we all have different paths of healing, but I also have seen in my practice and in my own life that there's different times for different types of healing. So sometimes I really lean on Western or allopathic medicine. Sometimes I really lean on indigenous medicine. And I think the biggest opportunity that we have right now is that we don't have to choose, that we can begin thinking holistically, that we can begin thinking synergistically, and thinking about how do these different medicines talk to one another? How do they reach different aspects of our being? How can we incorporate a little bit of this and a little bit of that? Because, we are full beings. And so we don't have to pick and choose, that we can really find the integration that works best for us at the particular moment that we're in, and to also expect that that may change too, over time.
Absolutely. I envision it a little bit like having a tool bag that has all these incredible modalities in the tool bag that we have at our disposal to
That's right.
support this process of healing. Do you want to share anything about the idea of healing and how healing works from the African and Indigenous healing systems? Like, what is the kind of idea behind supporting someone in moving more towards optimal health?
So there's two pieces that as I look across indigenous systems, and they all are so varied, right? If we look at every corner of the world has its medicine that has kind of emerged and served humanity for thousands of years. And so the through lines are what I'm really interested in. Even though the specific practices may differ, the through line, there's two things that I see. One is that there's no healing of the body that does not include the psyche and the spirit. And there's no healing of the psyche and spirit that does not include nature. And so all of these systems have at their foundation an appreciation for, a respect for, a reverence for, an integration of the natural world. And so looking at, well, how do we bring that here now? How do we honor this connection with the natural world and the intelligence of nature? So not just that nature is there and can help us and can do all of these wonderful things, which of course is true, but that there is a sentience and there is a consciousness and there's an intelligence and a life force that we are part of, that we are not separate from. And that has been one of the oldest concepts when we look across indigenous medicine and indigenous philosophy through indigenous cultures, this idea of this shared breath, this shared life force. As it has moved forward in Western psychology, we see a term called the anima mundi, which is translated from Latin as the soul of the world. And the opportunity that we have when we are living into indigenous medicine is this reconnection to the soul of the world and the many ways that we can embark on that.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much. And that leads beautifully to my next question because it's one aspect of this, synergy, if you will, with the natural world. Can you share a little bit about flower essences and how you use flower essence in your practice? What kind of changes people could expect from using them?
Absolutely. And I have to warn you that I get so excited about flower essences that I could easily spend the next 3 days talking about them because I love them so much. So I'll just start with what are flower essences. So if someone is listening to this and you're not quite sure what flower essences are, I'll start by describing them as vibrational remedies that are used to shift our perspective, used to support our emotional well being, and used to support our spiritual alignment. And so they are safe medicines that are, I would say, over the counter because they are regulated as a food in the US. So you can buy them easily online. You can find them in your larger health food stores. And then, of course, you can work with a flower essence practitioner like myself to use some of the flower essences that are a little less popular. So the idea of flower essence goes right back to what we were just speaking about in terms of the anima mundi and this idea of a sentient universe, a sentient natural world. And so a flower essence is the extraction of the intelligence, if you will, or the consciousness, if you will, of a particular flower. And then we ingest that through water. We use water as a medium to purify, to tone, to harmonize whatever thoughts, ideas, or emotions are out of sync with the rest of our being. And so, as every time that I describe what flower essences are, I imagine a room full of people who are with me to a certain point, and then their eyes kind of glaze over a little bit. And then, what is she talking about? So, the best metaphor that I can use to describe what a flower essence does is music. So, if we think about the musical world, if we think about a really beautiful symphony and a really beautiful orchestra playing beautiful music, and how every single instrument is doing its own thing, but it's in sync with the other instruments, and we get this beautiful, harmonious sound. So I think about our thoughts and emotions the same way. Our thoughts and emotions are all vibration, they all are their own music, they all are their own instrument. And so when we're healthy, we feel this harmony. The music of our soul is harmonious. It sounds like beautiful music. And then every now and then there's a thought or an idea or a feeling that is out of sync with that orchestra. Maybe it's anger or resentment or fear, or maybe we're telling ourselves that we're not good enough or we don't have enough. It's a lack mentality. So what happens in that orchestra is you have this beautiful music and then you have this one little instrument that's out of sync. And we feel that as emotion, we feel that as pain, we feel that as psychological distress. And so what we're doing with a flower essence is we're using a flower essence as a tuning fork. So the flower essence is that vibration of the flower, which we can see represented in the mathematical forms of nature if we're more oriented that way. Or we could think about it imaginally as if each plant has its own persona or personality, which is how I tend to lean. And so when we're bringing that flower essence into our being, it's harmonizing that part of ourself that is out of pitch so that we can come back into the organic, beautiful symphony of our lives.
That's such a wonderful metaphor. And, as you were sharing, I was thinking about all the times that I have personally used flower essences, used it with my children. When I was in private practice, used it with my patients. And what came to mind was that beautiful moment when you get, the right formula of the flowers and the person takes it for the first time. And invariably, there's like this deep breath. They just go, ah, and you just feel like they're just kind of unraveling and relaxing more deeply into themselves. I also love that they're so gentle and safe. Anyway, I too could go on and on about flower essences because I really love them. Can you talk a little bit more about flower essence therapy and this sort of soul medicine, this kind of deeper spiritual, perhaps, aspect to it?
Absolutely. And so flower essences, because they're so accessible, because they're relatively affordable, I believe they are one of the wellness industry's best kept secrets in terms of self care. And so flower essences can be used by any and all of us, just as we might have ibuprofen or aspirin in our cabinets for a headache or some kind of ache or pain. We can also have flower essences that are in our cabinet for those everyday moments of overthinking or inability to relax or feeling a little blocked in our heart space. Then there's flower essence therapy. And the difference between using flower essences and flower essence therapy is that flower essence therapy is really designed to support the movement into another archetypal expression of the self. So I can use an example from my clinical practice. If I'm working with a client that is maybe moving through life as the archetypal lover, right? They're very much a people pleaser. They're very kind and gentle souls, and they're very accustomed to making everyone happy around them. And then life happens as it tends to do, and now they're going through maybe a difficult situation at work and they're being challenged to be more assertive and to speak more loudly and more clearly and to stand more in leadership. That is going to require them learning, practicing, and ultimately emerging another way of being in the world that is maybe new, maybe foreign, and maybe connected to some wounds from their early development. Maybe they have a negative association with authority. And so there's a part of them that doesn't want to step into that, even though they know consciously that it will serve their leadership. So that's where flower essence therapy steps in because it supports us in this archetypal awakening, this archetypal emergence as I become more myself, more authentic in response to the life that I have and the path that I'm walking. The flower essences and flower essence therapy in particular support us in that transformation of becoming, which leads to the question of what do I mean by soul medicine? So I think of soul medicine as anything that touches those in between spaces that we need to be happy, healthy, and whole. So, by and large, at this point in medicine, we know what to do for our physical bodies, or we know which specialist or doctor to turn to. So, there is so much that modern medicine has contributed to knowing about the body, what it does, and what it needs. And of course, always more, right? There's always more that we can learn. But by and large, Western medicine is really adept at addressing the needs of the physical body when it can be diagnosed. And then in terms of spiritual practice, there are probably about as many different spiritual paths as there are folks listening to this conversation, right? And so I go back to the Taoist lineage, and the Taoist lineage says essentially your spirituality is your business and your responsibility. So we each have our own unique ways of connecting to the divine, to the creator, to the source, however we define it. And then there's the stuff in between, the stuff that is not quite a physical condition and the stuff that is not quite our spiritual path. And that is the place where soul medicine, including flower essences, are really effective. Again, it's that archetypal awakening, it's the bringing things out of the subconscious into conscious acknowledgement so that we can work on them, make different choices if we need to, deeper into our understanding of why we do the things that we do. And so soul medicine is really to touch those places. It touches our heart's desires, our frustration, our vision and our dreams, who and how we love, these pieces that can't quite be touched by a physical medicine and aren't quite held entirely by our spiritual work, that are just part of the humanity and what it means to be human. In East Asian medicine, we say that humanity stands between heaven and earth. And so here we have this soul medicine that touches the most human parts of our being and really supports it through the wisdom of nature.
Mm, thank you. So, what do you think flower essences could actually be used for? What kind of symptoms or mental health conditions do you like to pull them out of your bag to help people?
I pull out flower essences anytime there is emotional distress, anytime there is an emotion that seems stuck. And so in East Asian medicine, of course, as an acupuncturist, I often see the world through that lens when it comes to healing, that there is a place for every emotion. There is an appropriate time to feel grief. There's an appropriate time to feel anger, even. And so I look at flower essence where there's something that has gone awry in that process, where an emotion isn't flowing through or an emotion isn't teaching us the lesson or bringing the gift that that movement of energy is intended to do. And so that's one of the first places that I use flower essences. I also use flower essences whenever there is a limiting belief. So, as I mentioned before, not feeling good enough, not feeling like we have enough resources, all the ways that we are having these conversations in our heads, right, that are not quite serving us or moving us toward the vision that we have for our life. I like to say there's a flower essence for that, for literally every thought that we have, every emotion that we could feel. There's a flower essence out there that is quietly saying, there's a better way to do this. And so those are two of the places. And then another place where flower essences are super effective are in what I call soul evolution. And so those are those aspects of our being that show up across the board. So if I'm working on my boundaries in my parenting, I might need to work on my boundaries in my workspace or in my intimate relationships. The flower essences are really supportive there. But by and large, when I'm working with my clients, I tell them that flower essences are for any kind of soul hiccup. So if we're feeling anxiety, if we're feeling chronic sadness, if we're feeling alienated or loneliness, so many of the things that are really have been heightened by the recent years with COVID and the pandemic, the flower essences are sometimes a miraculous intervention for moving through those aspects of our healing that our hearts are longing for.
That's great. Thank you. So, can you share what it would take to train a practitioner to actually integrate flower essences into this work? Maybe someone's listening to this is like, oh, I want to learn more about that. How could they do that?
There are so many resources to learn about flower essences. In my work, I am the director of the Spirit Seed School, and we are specifically oriented to train practitioners and those on their own personal healing journey to work effectively with flower essences. So there's a few different parts to that training and that immersion. So the first level is just getting to know the flower essences and what they do, as we would in any herbal or pharmaceutical training. We want to know, what does this flower do? What are the indications for this flower? What are some case studies around this flower? That's a big part of just the practical research. But then what I found over time is that it's not just knowing the flowers. It's really learning how to see the world through ancient eyes. And so if we can remember and honor that flower essence therapy, as do many holistic medicines, emerge out of a different time and place, a different worldview, a different organization of consciousness, if you will, then that is part of what we're relearning when we're working with flower essences. Otherwise, it's very easy to pick up a flower essence, use it for a day or two, and then say, "Oh, it didn't work." Because the flower essences, as you know, and you've probably seen in your practice, they don't really hit you over the head. They are gentle, they are unassuming, they are meant to move with the authenticity of your own being. And so if you're not in a practice of slowing down enough to notice subtle shifts, then you might miss it. And so that's part of the training. How do you become present and develop that type of meditative presence to notice when you have a change in perspective, to notice when your client has started to awaken a new archetype? So that is part of the training. One of the things that we really spend a lot of time working on and learning about is the subtle body, and also these states of consciousness that were developed by a French philosopher, Jean Gebser, in the early 18th century. And so, with the subtle body, we're looking at plant medicine across the gamut and across the range of vibrational medicines. So, of course, that means that, a plant medicine can be a food and can work on more of a biochemical aspect within our being. If we're looking at a food or an herb for its micronutrients and its chemical properties and what it's doing in the bloodstream. That's one way of understanding the subtle body of a plant medicine. Then, if we extend a bit, we move into the etheric plane of a plant, and that's looking more at an essential oil or an herbal medicine or a plant that's being used to move the energetic life force of a person. That's a second way of understanding a plant. The third way of understanding a plant is through what we would call the astral or the mental body. And that ties back to that intelligence, that sentience, that soul message that a plant has. And that would, of course, be where the flower essences live. But also, I include high dose homeopathic remedies in that exploration. As you know, as a naturopath, you can give someone the right homeopathic remedy, and it's almost like a personality switch. Right. So that's the kind of relationship through the subtle body with the plant medicine. And then finally, there's the spiritual body. And that is looking at the rituals, both historical and recent, the religious practices that include plants as part of that medicine making, whether it's spiritual baths in some traditions, even to some extent, wearing certain scents. In other traditions, is part of that spiritual understanding to call in different deities or angels, as we see in some of the indigenous traditions. And so that's a huge part of the training. It's not just knowing a flower essence and what it can do and thinking about it in a very formulaic way, but also thinking about, how does this plant support humanity across its existence? And so being able to tune our attention to that is a huge part of that training. Another huge part of that training is looking at, as I mentioned, different states of consciousness. And so the evolving literature around what does it mean to be functioning from beta versus theta, alpha, gamma, delta, and so on? And how do we attune to nature through those different gateways of consciousness and understanding so that we can sink into being able to communicate with plant intelligence? In other words, we can't just use our regular waking mind because a plant is not necessarily going to speak to you in words in the same way that a person would. But there is a way to attune to what is the expression, what is the intention, what is the intelligence of that natural form.
Thank you. That's an incredible description. And I love this whole, layers of the body. And we see that in so many different traditions around the world about those the energetic aspects of our beingness. What do you think are the key learnings and understandings that are integral to effective practice? So, what makes a practitioner an excellent practitioner in this field?
The first, I would say, is the humility of doing our own work. So being in a process where you're not necessarily seeing yourself as the expert in the treatment room. What I tell my clients is that you are the expert of your own life. And I know a whole lot about flower essences because I study and love them and in relationship with them all the time. That makes for a great partnership. So, really welcoming a client into being a partner in their healing process, I think, is so critical in this work and in this paradigm of healing. Another aspect that I think is really critical is something that comes out of the practice of depth psychology, which is this idea of a religious attitude, which I learned from a remarkable researcher, Dr. Elizabeth Nelson, this idea of a religious attitude that allows us to be present to these small, quiet miracles that may show up in a patient's life. And so even sometimes that dream that comes to them while they're doing this work and they've been working on their relationship with their spouse and all of a sudden they have a dream about their father who maybe passed away. Those kinds of moments that we don't want to bypass, that we don't want to just write down on our intake sheet and check off the list, but really being able to hold the pause of the magnitude of all of the experiences that light up when we're working with this really subtle medicine that, the coincidence of, oh, I was working on my relationship and then I found this book and this book has been eye-opening for me that's not a coincidence, right? That it's not a coincidence that we are moving in a time. I like to refer to the difference between Chronos and Kairos. So Chronos being the chronological time that we can set our clock to, and then Kairos being the opportune moment. And often in this subtle medicine, in this energy medicine, we're working with these synchronicities and these coincidences and the way that things light up for us, that information comes to us that can't be planned or predicted, but is part of the healing journey. And so to be an effective practitioner, being ready to respond to those beautiful synchronistic moments and to be able to support the client as the partner in the healing and making meaning of what comes to them and allowing that to be unique to them.
It really is about this shift in worldview, which you've mentioned a few times, and being very present with the yourself, with the client, with the flowers. You mentioned this aspect of worldview that I thought was really interesting about the ancient, and you use this term neo-ancient. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So again, going back to the work of Dean Gebser, what he did in his book, The Ever-Present Origin, is he did this survey of human consciousness. And so looking at, what he labels as the archaic mind, the magical mind, the mythical mind, the modern mental mind, as I'm saying, if there's a lot of M's here, but the modern mind. And then he talks about something that he calls integral consciousness. And integrality is the ability to shift into these different phases that are part of our collective psyche, that are ancestrally part of how we know and experience the world as we need to. So it ties back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of some folks are going to resonate with more of the science of flower essences. Some are going to resonate more with the story or the mythical image of a particular flower. And so in this integral consciousness, it means that we have all of it here with us. And so when I say that I'm neo ancient or that my clients or colleagues are neo ancient, what I mean is that we're borrowing from the old world. We're borrowing from ancestral lineage. We are learning from old ways of seeing and being in the world, but we're not throwing out our modern comforts. We're not, you know, in every case, just going to say, okay, this modern world is causing anxiety and depression. So I'm just going to not use the internet anymore. And I'm not going to use my cell phone. That's not really practical and that's not realistic. And so when we're being neo ancient, we're using the best of modern technology, the best advantages of modern medicine, the best advantages of the times that we live in now, the zeitgeist of the times that we live in now. But we're also remembering and reawakening and living into the ancestral wisdom that we carry with us in our bones, in our subconscious, in our psyche, and of course in our hearts. And so that's what it is to be neo-ancient, is to live in these two worlds and to integrate a path forward that is both healing and moves us and pushes our collective forward. So there's a term in West African tradition that's called Sankofa. And Sankofa is this mythical bird that flies forward while it's looking behind him. And that's the idea of being neo-ancient. We are progressing forward, we are moving forward into the future, but we're bringing the past with us and we're bringing our acknowledgement, our honoring, and our reverence of ancient wisdom as we move in a modern world in a modern way.
That's great. And it really aligns with this concept of interconnection, which you've been talking about, interconnectedness with each other, with the nature world. And why wouldn't we be interconnected with the past as well? Because it has brought us to where we are today. And so bringing those learnings from that while we face forward, I love that image. That's really, really quite wonderful.
And it's helpful for some of my clients that are, say, maybe executives or working really high profile positions. So for that person, their fear, if you will, of doing this kind of medicine is like, oh, am I going to have to like leave my house and go live in the woods and plant a garden? And it's this kind of fear that we can't have. We can't live in the worlds that we live in. And so that neo ancient is, still run your board meetings, be the CEO of your company, and also maybe have some flower essences in your pocket for when you're lacking confidence or for when you need to assert yourself in ways that feel uncomfortable for you. So
Yeah,
that's an example of being neo ancient.
that's a great example. I also was reflecting on, this aspect of research. So, have shared already, I've personally seen positive benefits from the flower essences. And I know many other practitioners, yourself, many other practitioners who've really seen them help a lot of clients and patients. Um, and I imagine there's some case studies that have been published, but I really don't know if there's been any formal research done on flower essences. And I imagine part of that is because it's so individualized. Uh,
Mhm.
maybe you could do a study on rescue remedy for trauma or something like that. But it is so very rigorized and it may not lend itself to, a randomized controlled trial, etc. But I was curious if you know of any sort of literature or formal research that has been done on flower essences.
Absolutely. And, to your point, there are quite a few studies. Um, I would say not they don't capture the magic of flower essences, but perhaps that's the point, right? So there are some quantitative studies that look at, say, a rescue remedy or a particular flower for use in very specific situations. So there was one study that was like rescue remedy measuring the amount of anxiety for patients having first time dental work, right? They're very specific and very clear. And they do demonstrate that flower essences work if we need that type of research. I've found that some of the most interesting research of flower essences comes through more qualitative studies, looking at more of the case studies, looking at more of those types of research. The Flower Essence Society, which I work in partnership with for my practitioner training, has been clinically researching flower essences for well over 40 years. And so their materia medica of thousands and thousands of worldwide case studies is really a tremendous resource because you can start to see what are the themes that show up with each flower essence and to begin to test them right on your own when I'm training practitioners, and even often sometimes with my clients, they'll have a flower essence and I'll say, work with this flower essence first. Don't look up what it does because often there'll be this tendency to look it up in the book. So I'll say, don't look at what it does. Just work with this flower essence. Journal about your experience. And they'll do that, and then they'll work with it for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they'll look it up online or in the book or in the research, the materia medica. And there's always this moment of like, that's exactly what I experienced. And so that research is constantly evolving, constantly shape shifting, but it is out there. And I do feel really strongly, especially within the spirit seed, that as practitioners, we are also researchers. So we're looking at the literature that's out there, but we're also adding to the literature. We're also doing case study work. That is a huge part of the certification training, is that you do these case studies and work with a client over a period of 5 or 6 months to see what type of change is happening based on the formulas that you've created. So it is really a fascinating world. I also think that there is a lot of research that supports flower essences in terms of the integration of traditional medicines into counseling and psychotherapy. And there's a lot of research and literature out there on that topic that really ties some of the key concepts that underlie flower essence therapy in terms of indigenous worldviews with how they can support the modern approaches to mind body wellness, particularly in psychotherapy and mental health counseling. So between those two worlds, what's out there academically versus what's out there just within the field and within the profession, there's so much that we can do with that research, especially when people know where to look for it.
That's so wonderful. And I think it's so important for people to know because in the beginning of our talk today, you said, people might not know about flower essences. And I think you're right. They're kind of hidden. And it's like, oh, there may be some judgment. Oh, it's just this flower woo-woo stuff. It's just placebo, etc. And so I think it's important to mention these rigorous, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, that people have been actually studying this for many, many years. In modern times, like you mentioned, the early 18th century and even back into early human history. So I'm just really grateful that we got to highlight that a little bit. So considering what you have shared with us today, what do you think is the most empowering take-home message about health and healing that you'd like to leave with our audience?
Oh, that's such a rich question. I think I would go back full circle to where we started with this indigenous understanding that healing of the psyche and the soma includes nature. And so I would start there and say that we have the opportunity to include nature in our healing process. And in my book, I talk about that in 3 different ways. I talk about this kind of DIY practice of ecotherapy, which is, are you going outside for a walk? Do you have plants in your home? Are you opening your window to catch the breeze? Just very, basic things that we can do. And then there's the communal practice of ecotherapy, which is deepening our relationship with the earth and its sustainability, and deepening our commitment to social justice and equity. and how those things intersect with one another. So, whether that's being part of a community garden or advocating for environmental justice, that's another way to incorporate into our healing that we're not separate from that, and that we're the soul of the world, right? The ache and the heartache that we feel as humanity, that the earth may be feeling and reflecting to us as well. And then finally, I would offer there's the more archetypal clinical work with nature, which might include acupuncture and flower essence therapy. Of course, I'm biased, but might include any of the other herbalism or any of the other forms of healing, including traditional and modern practices that reconnect us to the soul of the world and to nature and how its imprint is on our bodies and on our being. So if I could leave us with any one pivotal thing to do, it would be to find our way in that. Where is the place where we can welcome the healing of nature and the wisdom of nature into our process, whether it's our relationship in our home with plants, or whether it's going deeper into this archetypal understanding of the imprint of nature on our human psyche.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. It's been such a pleasure connecting with you today. And thank you to the audience for being with us in this wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.